much. All right, well, I figured I would start off the talk, the prototyping mastery talk, by showing a prototype to kick things off. All right, so this is a project that I worked on, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm not going to give you any context. I'm just going to let it play, and you can behold. All right, isn't that great? So this is actually really horrible. You should never do this. There's way too much going on. Like, I built this in Flash, and because that's what I know. And this is HTML website. And I learned a valuable lesson after this. I even posted this to Dribble and was like, oh, this is going to be a great shot. And then I had people like, oh my gosh, people are going to be looking for the back button. And I was like, no way, man. The user is going to know that obviously this needs to go over there when you're searching, and then you got to see the results later. And then after about 30 minutes, I was like, this is really bad. And so just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. And yeah, so I've built lots of prototypes that way and made many mistakes where I was thinking, oh, this will be amazing. And I just built it because it's easy to make stuff move across the screen and make it seem cool. And I would just kind of keep this in the back of my mind. Just because you can build something in Flash doesn't mean you should. And so you may have seen this quote going around on Twitter: prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. I did some digging to try to find out like who to attribute this to, and I'm pretty sure it's David Kelly, one of the founders of IDEO. But I also saw people attributing it to Mike Davidson, who used to be the senior vice president of Twitter, of design or something like that. And then some other random guy from IBM said that he said it. So I figured I'd just tack on a few other ones as well. And actually, I prototyped this joke on Twitter the other day. And I figured, 41 likes is not too shabby, so I would just throw it in there. So the power of prototyping right there. So before I get into like actual real prototypes, I want to ask a question. What is a prototype? Depending on your experience or your circumstances, you might define a prototype a certain way. Sometimes it's animation, sometimes interaction, sometimes it tells a story. So I'm going to queue up some group participation here and ask, what is a prototype to you? How would you explain a prototype to someone else? Anybody? Prototype. What's a prototype? A proof of concept that shows the interactions before they're developed. Does anybody else have anything like completely different? There's no wrong answers here yet.
It could even be as simple as like sketches on a notebook. It just kind of says we want this to do this.
Sketches on a notebook. Last chance. Any more? All right. I will move on from the awkward silence. Okay. So I like to get kind of nerdy with words sometimes, and this time is no different. So I looked up the word prototype just to kind of, just to get the real understanding of the actual word. You know how like we designers are always debating on who's the designer and should we code and like the deep existential questions of life. So the original or model on which something is based or formed, the original or the model. Another definition is something analogous to another thing of a later period, so some characteristics originally that will apply to something later. And then lastly, to create the prototype or an experimental model. This is obviously the verb prototype. And I feel like this last definition, experimental model, kind of led me down another Webster's Dictionary rabbit hole. And so I was like, well, let me look up experiment and model and see, what this means. So we have the word experiment with a crazy pronunciation, apparently. This is a scientific procedure undertaken to make a discovery, test, hypothesis, demonstrate a known fact. So an experiment. Everybody probably knows that already. Model, I thought this was pretty interesting. A system or thing used as an example to follow or imitate. And I don't know, I feel like experimental model just felt like it had a better definition than the word prototype. And there's lots of different things that goes into creating a prototype. And you can obviously make things go crazy, and that's definitely an experiment. But you kind of have to know, when and why to do an experiment and a prototype, and instead of just like how to do it. And I feel like knowing when and why is equally as important as knowing how to do it. So based on my experiences, like creating all of these crazy Flash prototypes and then moving on to some better tooling, even though I still do a lot of stuff in Flash, I kind of came up with these. At first I called these prototype types, or types of prototypes. But the more I like dug into it, I felt like they were more like phases. Like a prototype, it's a loud word. They have these phases. And so I feel like the first phase is more like a conceptual phase. And I kind of want to throw a disclaimer in here. Like prototypes, they don't have to be only conceptual and start off this way and then go through this phase. I feel like you can create a prototype, and then sometimes it's conceptual, and sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, who you're showing the prototype to, it can change phases. So we got persuasive, we got validative. I'm pretty sure I made that word up just because it felt weird to say validation. Instructional. And then you have the actual thing. I feel like this is kind of where the design systems fall in the category. Like if you're just throwing together a quick idea with a systematic design like Bootstrap or someone that's created a custom design system, it feels prototypey, and it kind of falls into this category. So I want to talk about each one of these phases and then show some prototypes that I've created that I feel like falls within these categories. And so first off, this conceptual phase, I feel like this is where new ideas are born. This is where things are experimental. You're testing things. You're shaking things up. You're just playing around. You're exploring, finding happy accidents or mistakes, as you saw earlier. And just trying to answer the question, like, what if? What if this thing does this? And I feel like if you tell yourself up front you're building a conceptual prototype, it kind of frees you from judgment, and you can just be like, no, this is just a prototype. I'm just playing around here. You don't have to come down on me hard about all the flying around and stuff. So you're asking this what if question. And so the next couple of slides are just some random like one-off conceptual prototypes where it's like, I worked with Rody a couple years ago to help design their apps and the first version of their website. Things look a little different now since I was involved, but this was like, just like a simple little home screen animation. I think I also may have built this in Flash. Just because I know Flash from way back in the day, it's just easier for me to like bust that stuff out. So this was just kind of like hey, what if we, is that my mouse cursor? No, that's a screenshot. This was just, like something simple, like a small, quick little animation, like, hey, what if we did this? Some more stuff from Rody. This was like, hey, what if we had this like little animated squirrel crunching numbers while they tried to, I feel like this is more of like the animation prototype. I think when we're talking about prototype in this sense, I'm thinking like, okay, animation, how are we going to like make this one screen? But if I'm thinking that while you're thinking, oh, well, the interaction model, there's just like two completely different prototypes. And you could even make the argument that this is not a prototype. I don't know. And then we saw this monstrosity already. I will just let you see that one more time. This was conceptual also. And this is another conceptual prototype that I designed like back in 2013 or 2014. Like this little idea of this label floating above an input field. And it turned out that a lot of people thought that was really cool, and it started kind of being used in Google material design, and you can see it in like Slack's iPhone app and a lot of different places. So that was kind of an interesting result to a conceptual prototype that I just put together. So I think even though I've made really bad prototypes, I've made sometimes okay prototypes as well. So the second phase of the prototype, am I making that screen shake? It looks like it's kind of like, it's just the screen. So like if you're in the persuasive phase, you're trying to tell a story with your prototype, or you're trying to prove a theory, or you're trying to build trust or convince someone of something. Maybe you're trying to convince a client that it needs to be done a certain way, or you're trying to convince a coworker that it needs to be built a certain way. Or maybe you and the client together are trying to convince investors that they should invest in this product because look at our prototype. This is our idea. It's kind of our first proof of concept. And I definitely think that a lot of what I do falls into this category, whether it's working directly with a developer, trying to persuade the development team that they should spend a little bit more time building this custom thing, or showing them something and be like, no, that'd take 2 weeks longer to build it that way. Let's not do that. And so it's kind of like a give and take. I feel like trying to convince someone is always a two-way street. So here are a few persuasive prototypes. This is digging deep into the archives. iOS 6. I don't even know what year that was. But this is kind of another embarrassing example. We're trying to convince the client that we needed a navigation drawer, and then you could go back to the drawer and go to these other areas, which, I mean, it's not too bad. But we spoke to no developer on this until like 6 months after we designed and prototyped everything, which is a very bad idea. Lots of nice hidden gems for a developer to see in there. Like, oh, that's going to triple the scope. So our persuasive prototyping was not as successful in this project. This is another quick little prototype that I made for Roadie. If anyone's not familiar with Roadie, it's where you have an item that you want to ship and someone comes to pick it up and then you send it on its way. And so this was kind of like the in progress gig, and I had an idea for showing like different buttons, different call to actions along the way. So when you say I'm on the way, I wanted to show just like a subtle parallaxy kind of scroll thing. I don't think this ever made it into the app, but this was me trying to persuade the team that, hey, it would be cool if we did this. I don't think it worked, but it's worth a shot. And sometimes it helps to start your persuasive prototype with a story. This is a project that I worked on last year. Not very exciting. It is a law firm client communication app. And not only any law firm, this is a personal injury law firm. So like the big one call, that's all type posters, all that good stuff. So there was a law firm, and actually I don't know if I should say everything, but anyway. They haven't finished building this yet. But the first thing we did was a small design project where I got with them and they wanted to put together a prototype so they could pitch it to a larger investor and some other partners. They wanted to sell this to existing law firms and maybe white label it, figure it out along the way. And so, we got in there and they had already sketched out these lawyers had already sketched out all of these screens and these UI designs. Not that lawyers can't design things, but you could imagine, I think there was one request to have an Uber tab so the clients could get picked up to go to their treatment. So we cut that out. And but we sat down and we were like, okay, what do we? They were like, oh, the process needs, and they're talking about the Uber feature and that. And I'm like, we need to figure out what this prototype's going to do. So just let's sit down, let's figure out story. I need to know what the process is when someone comes in with their neck and their back hurts. What happens? What's that process like? So we kind of wrote down some pain points and talked about, it took them a while to get to this point, but we're like, okay, there's this guy named Donald. He comes in, he sits down with the client, and I've got to move you to this. There we go. Catch up to me. There we go. All right, so I'm not going to go through all the boring details, but we just literally went step by step. What happens when the client comes in? And how do they get their first appointment for their treatment, for their chiropractor? And, do you guys send reminders? Do you follow up with them? And there's this big, long treatment process. Then there's evidence collection phase. And I didn't know any of this, so I'm just sitting there typing what's next? What's next? And I want to know exactly what happens from the user or from their customer. And we're not even designing any interfaces. I feel like 99% of my projects start with just a long list like this. And so I use this document to just design out some like medium to high fidelity screens in Sketch. And I was like, probably makes sense to just upload these to InVision and create this little quick little clickable prototype. So we didn't even really worry about the full architecture of the app because it was really all about telling the story of their idea so they could pitch it to their investor. They weren't ready to build it, and they didn't have the means to build it anyway, so we just kind of made this thing. And again, I'm not going to go through too crazy amount of details, but this is like all the things that they would tell the user up front. And this is kind of like ended up being like a chatbot style thing. It's like, hey, your appointment's going to be coming. You know, I need to record a log, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff happens. It's like very linear. And we wanted to show like what happened during the whole case because like 99% of all the cases are the same. And so we were trying to use this as a persuasive prototype to convince their investors to give them money. And the next prototype that I made for this, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because this was actually more instructional and the thing. But these are kind of like the final designs of the chatbot style. But it was like all of this is the same, and to create all of this inside of Sketch or whatever else, it's kind of a nightmare to deal with this much content, this much text. So I just made this in HTML and CSS, coded a few classes, and floated some annotations over there. And now the developers could just scroll through and see the whole process. And now we have like some simple annotations over there. You can see, you know, what's supposed to happen because the back-end developer is also trying to write all the scripts for all of the if statements and all of the functions that need to happen. And so we're just showing like it's just easier for me to type all this out in HTML once all the styling is done. So this is another, you know, maybe unconventional way to prototype, but I still feel like this is a prototype just like, as much as anything else. But even though I didn't use a prototyping tool other than, you know, a text editor. But this was not in the persuasive phase, but I felt like it made sense to put this in here. So the third phase, the validative phase, validation, I should probably change that. I feel like this is where you're trying to cover technical feasibility. I'm trying to talk to a developer to say, like, hey, can we do this? Like, is this even possible? Or would you be willing to do this? Trying to visualize things, and you're going kind of beyond theoretical, and it's like this is getting closer to be what we're working with here. And instead of showing, you know, a bunch of boxes with arrows drawn between them, you know, we're actually kind of showing the flow. Everything seems like it makes sense. If I've ever done wireframes and I've got this like nice bird's eye view and everything is, all right, there's the login and there's an arrow drawn to this screen and then we go there and then there's a decision point and you can just kind of see it all. It's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you show it to other people on a giant PDF and maybe you whiteboard it out and it's like, this is a nice looking flow. But then nobody ever sees it that way. I mean, I do enjoy thinking through things that way, and I think it's very, you know, there's an advantage to seeing the bird's eye view of everything and having the holistic picture. But at the end of the day, you're still going to be doing things on one screen. And so I feel like at this validation stage, showing the flow and actually going through it, you can get much better feedback than you can just visualizing this never-ending long square pointer thing. And then you can also do user testing at this stage. If you have, you know, workable flow and prototype and you're asking questions about your prototype. So some validative examples here. This was a desktop app for a cryptocurrency called My Monero. Anyone into cryptocurrency in here? I'm not either. Although they did pay me in Bitcoin, which was very interesting. I can tell you how to get that into your bank account if you need to. But this was, so I never really created a traditional prototype, and it just kind of depends on the project in terms of like what I decide to use. Like sometimes I'll just go straight into Sketch. Sometimes I'll use a Word document or a Markdown document, whatever. This one I'm designing all of this stuff in Illustrator because I wanted to have these like, I did want to do some of these like bird's eye flows because this was not easy for me to understand. I don't understand cryptocurrency very well, and I needed to like really get the whole picture before I started. So I'm just like, these are some of the final Illustrator wireframes. I'm like, hey, if you click here, you go to here, and if you do this, you can go and do that. Here's a drop-down thing. Not really a prototype, but it's, to Sean's point, this is kind of a prototype-esque. Some different things. And then once I went from there, I kind of designed all the stuff in Sketch once I had all the low fidelity stuff, and the developer's like, yeah, this looks good, we can build this. So I was doing all that before I worried about the colors and stuff. And then I copied and pasted the Sketch flat files inside of XD because it was like quick to make some like hotspots and export this quick little, like literally the only thing I was doing right there was trying to find out if the slide up or slide down felt better, because we were doing somewhat of an unconventional desktop app. We weren't like strictly following like Mac iOS guidelines. And I wish I could fast forward through some of that, but it was really just, I was chatting with the developer during the whole project, and so they're able to sign off on a lot of the interactions before I have to really show them. And so once I get to a certain point, I can just create these little tiny validation prototypes where it's like, oh, it feels good to slide up from the bottom, or it looks good sliding down. And then I can, click this, go to the next thing. It's just like a quick little like, yeah, that feels good. And it doesn't have to be this like crazy big prototype thing. It's just like to prove a quick point. Build it in like, a few minutes. And then same thing, I exported these sketch files, or JPEGs rather, whatever they were, PNGs, into XD, drew some little rectangles on them. And literally for this tiny prototype, the address flies down, you got this little drop down, like, yeah, that feels pretty good. Just toggling between two different screens. And that was my prototype. That was another small little validation prototype. And I sent the URL to the developer, and he was like, yeah, I feel like that'll work. And I feel good about that. Like, it takes you a couple minutes to put that together, and you can just move on. You're solving a really specific problem. You have a very specific goal that you're trying to achieve with something like that. All right. Feel free to stop me at any point. Sometimes I just keep going. Yes.
Like how that was different than just sending them a link and they got it. The XD link.
You mean so we would do a screen share, and I would share my screen and I would walk them through and say like, here's this screen, here's all the functionality. When you click here, then I'd pan over on my document and show then you would go to this screen and this is what I'm thinking. And I really needed that because I didn't know they knew way more about cryptocurrency than I did. I was just learning about it, and you really have to have that subject matter expert it's like your user research at all times, like pulling from someone that knows about it. And they say, oh, well, this doesn't make sense because we validate this key on the server and where you have that. And I'm like, okay, I'll change that. And so I'm actually in Illustrator, moving files around while we're talking and making little notes and trying to solidify the functionality before I got too into colors and fonts and gradients and all that. And so I don't do that for every project, but for this one, since it was a little more complex, I wanted to have a really good functional foundation that the CEO felt good about, the head developer felt good about, and that I was like, okay, we're not going to make any crazy changes. It's not going to be like I'm going to go away for 3 months and then unveil the curtain on the cryptocurrency app that I didn't even know how it worked. And then once we got to the design phase, everything was pretty much fleshed out minus the last 10%, and then we were just introducing some interactions and stuff like that. But for that project, I was in communication with a developer almost every day, just asking questions nonstop. And you can come up with ideas too that they have done a certain thing a certain way, but then you're like, oh, we could shoot. Anyway, it's just good to collaborate like that. Did that answer your question? Yes. Anybody else?
Why did you do the low fidelity in Illustrator?
Because I really like Illustrator. I was a graphic design major back in 2003, 4, 5, and we use Illustrator all the time. And I just got really good at Illustrator, and I know all the quick keys, and I can move stuff around really quickly, and it's way easier to draw lines and add stuff, and it's like a vector powerhouse. And so I really like it. Sometimes I start off in Sketch for low fidelity stuff, but if I need some complex user flows and interactions, trying to draw a line that does this in Sketch is kind of a painful thing to do. So it just depends on the project. Some fellow Sketch line drawers over here. Illustrator. Oh yeah. Okay, so this is another kind of like validation slash persuasive prototype. There was a company called Siempo that wanted to create a new like smartphone, like a minimal smartphone that was like no distractions, like minimal, distraction free, and they actually tried to kickstart it, but they tried to raise a lot of money. They did not raise a lot of money, and so they're doing something else. But before they did that, they hired me to like come up with some new interactions, and I actually built a lot of wireframes in Illustrator, and then I did a lot of designs in Sketch. But then I built this prototype in Flash. But I feel like this one is way less suckier than my first one. So I'm just going to play this thing. The top part was like a giant input, and as you typed, everything was almost like an autocomplete field. And as you selected things, the things below it would change, and I could say like, oh, I want to text Jessica, and then I could text Jessica right there. And at any point, I could, after I'm interacting with things, I could go and hit the X in the top right to make that go away. But it's really hard to do this without animation. Like, it would be very difficult to do this inside of like an InVision prototype. Even though they do have things like that are interactive, like screen to screen to screen is not going to be very compelling. Because even when we were doing this, they were thinking about raising money with investors, and they just needed something that like looked cool that showed off their product. So yeah, built this in Flash because I know how to use Flash really well. I did a lot of Flash websites, and that's why I still use it. Yes?
So would you say that Flash is still a viable tool for animated prototypes, or is there something better?
It is for me.
Okay, fair.
They paid me for this.
Okay,
And it's actually Adobe Animate now. It just feels weird calling it that. I would not suggest going and learning Flash or Adobe Animate.
okay, sure. For someone who doesn't have any experience doing animated prototypes, what would be a good program to start with?
I mean, I don't know. Like,
Just write it in CSS.
I mean, honestly, the reason I like Flash and Animate is because you can take a red ball and create a keyframe, and then you move the red ball over here, and you create another keyframe, and then you say, I want to tween. And then you hit play, and it says, brrr, and you're like, oh, I just animated something. It's very simple.
So do you see After Effects now this stuff more in that respect,
Yeah, so I've done some After Effects animation, but it's just like, it's like Adobe Animate times 1,000. There's just a lot of stuff going on. And a lot of people do amazing stuff in After Effects. I just feel like very overwhelmed every time I open After Effects, and I'm like, if you had a choice to learn Flash or After Effects, I would probably do After Effects. Yeah. Yeah, do After Effects. It's probably got a better rendering engine anyway. Bless you. One more Flash prototype. This was called flow mode. You could like push a button, a hard button on the side, and you would go into this like distraction-free, almost like do not disturb in your settings on your iPhone. But this was just showing another interaction. This is my debut as a hand model here. And so again, these are prototypes that they were using to try to persuade investors, and I feel like these were straddling the persuasive phase and the validation phase because their developers were also building like an Android, like root Android build of this stuff, and they were using a lot of these as kind of like some models to build off their interactions. It's a great finger. Yeah, so the fourth phase, instructional. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is how it should work. Build it this way. But you got to be careful with this. You don't want to instruct someone, especially if you're not the developer and you hand it to a developer and you're like, hey, build it this way. You don't want to instruct until you've persuaded, and you don't want to instruct until you've confirmed with the developers. There's been plenty of times where I've done things that are crazy, and it's like, oh yeah, we're not building that. Because I just had no idea of the constraints of the technology. And so if there's any developers in the room, anyone? Yeah. Yeah, everyone's like giggling about it because they're like, oh yeah, I've seen that. So yeah, don't instruct people unless you've already persuaded and you're like, okay, now that we're all in agreement, this is what should happen. And so I've got just a few examples of instructional prototypes. This was another deep archive iOS 6. This is like the top of an iPad app back in iOS 6 days. And it's hard to explain, but I wanted these animations to happen. It was like, hey, I made these CSS animations because we were building this with like web technology at the time, which is, I don't think is a good idea for native stuff. But I did want to show like, hey, this is what the blinking light should look like, because there were these different phases of the project. And it was like, hey, I literally wrote all the CSS for you. Please use this CSS. And so I felt like this was, you could see that there's a CSS bug in the last part. But that was, I feel like that's an instructional prototype. Like, hey, I did all this work for you. You don't even have to dig into the files and pull out the stuff, you know, write a little bit of CSS, even wrote some JavaScript for those button functions. And I don't feel comfortable writing much JavaScript, but, you know, Google goes a long way. Here are some great iOS 6 slides of this iPad app. I just couldn't resist. This is not part of the prototype, but it was just pretty crazy. It was kind of cool, but also not great. This was also another iOS 6 app. And I really just was like, hey, developer, I want the animations to do this. It was hard to explain it, you know, so I just built this in Flash real quick. And I wasn't sure how to do, I didn't want to like write a bunch of parallaxy code, so this was, I feel like this is another instructional thing. Like, I know it's possible to do some like delays on some animations just based on my limited development skills, so this is another way to have an instructional prototype. Another roadie example. This is another instructional prototype where I was like, it would be really cool if we had these little animations. You saw the squirrel animation earlier. This was like a pull to refresh concept where it's like, hey, so maybe somebody's delivering a little truck. What if we, you know, did it where when you pulled it down, the truck came in? So it's like, it's conceptual, but then once they approved it and I persuaded them with it and it kind of moved through these phases, then they used it as reference to actually build it that way. And I think, I'm not sure, I haven't used Roadie in a while, but I think that animation's still in it. And I threw this back in here because this was another instructional prototype back from the law app. It was like, hey, this is the code that I wrote. Like, you don't have to use this code, but this is kind of how you could build it. So yeah, instructional prototype, straight up HTML and CSS. I feel like the last phase is kind of like the thing. It's kind of moved beyond prototype phase. You're actually building it, the actual thing. And so like with this phase, which may or may not even be defined as a prototype, it could be, it's like building quickly, something with Bootstrap or somebody's design system. You're just throwing together components. Maybe you're just firing up your text editor and you're writing some good old-fashioned HTML and CSS. You're shipping early, you're iterating. You're launching your beta, building the MVP, design systems. They're the hotness right now. Everybody's building a design system. I feel like design systems are kind of like prototype because like as you build the design systems, you're kind of developing it as you're designing it, and it's just kind of this big hodgepodge of like prototype / the thing. And when you're done, it's, you know, it's the thing. So here are a couple examples of the thing in which I've worked on. So this is not a prototype, but it will lead up to it. So I made a online UX course with Illustrator just because I liked using it so much. And I was like, hey, it'd be cool to teach how to use Illustrator for UX design, especially when it comes to like responsive web design. And I was pretty stubborn about it and decided, hey, I'll also build my own course platform to like host it on. And I know, of course, I got to wireframe it. I need to develop it and design it. And so I made a couple of wireframes for the course platform. And then I was like, well, I want to write all the front-end code for this, so I'm just going to go straight from here, straight to HTML and CSS. And so this whole screen here, which was like, I feel like it's okay. I didn't design anything with Sketch or anything. I just wrote the HTML and the CSS. I think Sean watched me do a lot of this. So yeah, it's responsive. It's kind of like a prototype. I wasn't really that happy with it. I feel like it worked, and the developer partner that I had was constantly building stuff, and it was working, and I felt like it was more of a prototype. So then I ended up building this, and then I went back to Sketch and refined it a little bit, and then just kind of redid it a little bit, and then recoded it. And so I feel like because I built the prototype and then I went and designed it, it was easier to go and just like adjust the theme and make some, adjustments to turn the prototype into the thing. And so even though I wasn't dealing with a client or anyone else, it was, that process of like iterating through the different phases of the prototype. This project I worked on with a company called Skyscanner, who is like a Travelocity of sorts from Scotland, although they just sold to a giant Chinese company for like $1 bajillion. Negative. Yeah. So I did a lot of like mobile design, a ton of work for this. This is just like one tiny sliver, but they were building everything in Angular, and I don't know Angular, but I was tasked with designing this dashboard with these charts. And like anytime a designer gets to design some charts, like the temptation is strong to like do these like gradients with like Nike Plus stuff. And you're like, ooh, look at these long shadows. Like looking at Dribble and like, oh, that's so awesome. But I knew that this team, like they had a deadline to launch this project, or the two like co-founders of this smaller app that they acquired like weren't going to get vested in their stock. Like they're not going to build custom charts when they're trying to hit this deadline. So I was like, well, I'll do some research, and I found highcharts.com. I was like, I'll pop these in here and like see what, like I'm not going to design these. Like there's code you can just pop right in. And so I built this little HTML prototype with some like, some of their real data, and like, hey, these charts are responsive. It's not like the best responsive build in the world, but it was just like a quick idea to kind of confirm with the development team, like, hey, can we use this? Like instead of designing all the stuff, like another instructional / the thing prototype. So yes, that was Skyscanner. All right, so the last project I want to show is a project that I worked on last year, and I don't feel like it's that necessary to go through like all the different things, but it was a design system that I got the extreme pleasure to work on with Dan Mall and Brad Frost and Josh Clark, and I'm so excited that Josh somehow convinced the people at ExxonMobil to allow him to like talk about it, because now I can like put it in here. So I worked with them on a design system for ExxonMobil, and it was just completely iterative the whole time. Like we were designing, and then we were writing code, and then we're designing, and then we're writing code, and then we were taking screenshots of that. And there was really no prototype. It was like the prototype was the thing, and we just made the thing the whole time. And then when we got done, it was always the thing. So there's just like a little video that goes with it. Actually, I do have audio on this one slide. Where's my man at? There you go. Audio, I forgot. Are we good? All right.
Meet Unity, our new ExxonMobil design system that makes building exceptional
The
web
client did the
applications
voiceover.
faster than ever. At
It's
the
kinda
heart of
funny.
Unity is a set of ready-to-use UI components and page templates that developers use to quickly assemble interfaces. It's as simple as copy and paste to bring these components into a project. By reusing these UI components across projects, developers can create beautiful, intuitive interfaces with less work. Unity is built on a foundation of modern best practices for user experience. All markup is fully responsive, so it works great on any screen size. Unity also embraces high standards for accessibility, usability, and performance. Unity was built on ExxonMobil's existing brand guidelines, so apps get the right look and feel right out of the box. Unity styles the basic colors, fonts, and icons so developers can focus their energy on real challenges. Get started and learn more at GoToUnity. Let's bring Unity to ExxonMobil's apps.
There you go. All right, that was Unity. There you go. Figured that would be like more interesting than me talking about a bunch of like. There you go. I would like one Unity, please. Okay. Hard transition to prototyping tooltips. Not actual tooltips, but just like tips for prototyping tools. And we've kind of covered this already, but I've got a slide for it, so we'll go with it. Just use what's available. Like if you've got After Effects because you have Creative Cloud, just use After Effects. Use what you're comfortable with. The software doesn't really matter. Like as long as you have a specific goal and you are achieving that goal, and like maybe it's to have an animated GIF or GIF if you're weird, or movie, or like a movie to put into your deck or something like that. And just a little thing to make you feel better. I still build most of my animation prototypes in Flash, so you should still feel pretty good about whatever you're using. Just use what you're good at. It doesn't really matter. As long as you're like, unless there's like a very specific thing that a company was like, oh, we use Axure for this, and we use, then you might need to like conform to what they're doing. And some quick little like prototyping do's and don'ts. I feel like this was kind of necessary. Some of this is repetitive, but I feel like it's worth kind of driving home the points. Do's. You need to have a very specific goal. You don't want to just create a prototype just for the sake of creating a prototype. Like even if you're experimenting, it's like, I just kind of want to play with this thing, and I know I'm just experimenting with motion patterns. Like if your end goal is to find a cool motion pattern, at least then you have like an idea of like what you're even doing. So you do want to like test and explore new ideas, but with a caveat. I showed you an example of when I was testing a new idea at the very beginning, and it was like the crazy thing. Like, so just make sure that you're not going too crazy with it. And I'll let that one lie. And you do want to show specific flows. Like, and what I mean by that is, you don't need a prototype for your entire app, and everything's clickable, and here's every drop down, and here you click around. It's like every static screen for the entire app is all clickable. I personally feel like that's a waste of time. But if you're going to show a very specific flow, like this is the onboarding flow. Click through here and you can make decisions about a very specific flow. And you might have a giant app with a bunch of different flows, but maybe a prototype for only a few little pieces. And it's just like to help make decisions. So I feel like you do want to show specific flows, but not like everything. And you want to it's helpful to tell a story with real content. I could have made that law firm app with a bunch of lorem ipsum, but then it just wouldn't have made sense. And the people they were trying to pitch it to, they wouldn't have known what it even meant. And so just the fact that we picked a guy, his name was Donald Butler, and he got his neck hurt in this accident, like we kind of crafted all these details. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. But it was a real story, like a real story that you could kind of follow along. And your brain, for whatever reason, can't resist a good story, and it's easier to follow along on a story. So when you can tell a story with real content, I recommend it. And you do want to work collaboratively with the developers, with the client. You don't want to run away and build a crazy thing without talking to someone about it first. Like the more you can communicate about your ideas and your goals, it's gonna work better for everyone. It's kind of the same thing here. Communicate with stakeholders. Make sure you set expectations. For the law app, I had to constantly remind them, like, we're not building the app right now. This is not, don't even worry about the tab bar at the bottom. Those things might change. Like, we're just showing the messages and how this would work. The expectation at the end of this prototype is that we're going to just have a full flow, and then we're done. And so we're not doing anything else. And so anytime they would ask about the Uber feature or whatever else, it's like, no, we're just doing this one story. This is the story you need to tell to your investors. And we're just setting a good expectation from the very beginning. All right, don'ts. Color change. Don't make it unrealistic. Don't make features that can't be implemented. And you're not going to know this unless you know how to implement it yourself, or unless you talk to someone about who knows how to implement it. Your developers are your friends. Developers talk to your designers. Teach them things. Don't charge forward without talking to your developers or developer. I can't say that enough. It's really important. And don't take every piece of feedback as a new requirement for the project. If you've set a specific goal and you get some random feedback, it's not like, oh, now I got to work in this new thing to the project. If you're very intentional about your goal up front and you get it started, then it's going to go better. And definitely, just do not prototype everything. I've seen a lot of people that have like, oh, let me show you this app that we've been working on. We've been designing it for 6 months. Here's our prototype. And it's like 30 seconds to load the envisioned prototype because there's like 1 million screens in it. And then they click, and it's the drop down, and then you go to this flow, and then you go around, and it's like, that's pretty impressive that you spent that much time building a prototype. But it's like, are you going to build, is there like a mobile version? Or, and it's just like the prototype became the project, and there was not even a developer on board yet. And I feel like that's a pitfall for prototypes. Like, don't prototype everything. And lastly, I want to leave you with a parting words of wisdom from Sir Jony Ive. Johnny Ive? Johnny? I think it's Johnny. If you are truly innovating, you don't have a prototype you can refer to. There you go. And that's it. Happy to answer more questions if anybody has any.
Do you ever do user testing early in your process, like a sleeper prototype, to know that what you're designing is actually what they want?
I do not. I don't think that it's a bad idea, but I also think that there can be a tendency to design something like without much thought and then like, oh, let's test that. Let's see what, does that button do better? And like you haven't even really critically thought about the problem yet. And so I'm not opposed to user testing. I think it's really good, but I feel like if you're doing it too quickly, you could just user test your way into not building a product or building something that like 10 different people told you 10 different things and you're like, oh, let's change this button and move it around. And so I don't do a lot of that. So.
You just mostly go with like tried and true standards and practices for stuff you know is probably important to click on, and then like when you can tell a more interesting story, then you kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some best practices for like forms and things like that. And I mean, there are like sometimes it just makes sense. Like we need that button to go to that screen. I don't really need to test it just yet. Maybe later we'll test red versus blue and see which one the conversion rate is higher. But for forms and things like that, for anything that like requires more complex interaction, like for that like request quote like thing that flew around, we had one of the client's friends come in and like click and they were like, oh my God. And we were like, okay, yeah, this is a bad idea. And I mean, it's like a double-edged, user testing for me is like a double-edged sword. Like I think it's important, but not so important that it should replace like critical design thinking and designing. Yeah.
Will your slide deck or a version of it be available?
I will put it online at some point. If you follow me on Twitter, I will tweet it out when it's ready. Or you can email me. You can go to my website and dig around, and it probably will be the most recent blog post in the not too distant future. Sure. It's actually in Dropbox now. I could just right-click and send it to you. Right there.
On the topic of managing expectations, especially when like the product owners and product managers that I work with, like they'll get confused between, the prototype versus like the actual thing or
Yeah.
even when I try to say up front like, hey, this is just a wireframe, we're just looking at the interactions, that's the only thing we feedback on, they'll still get kind of caught in the weeds like, oh,
Yeah.
I think someone literally looked at the Lord and said, like, why is it in Spanish?
Yeah.
How do you like rein in those conversations and kind of bring it back on task in a diplomatic way?
Yeah, I think that it's just, I feel like it's a tricky, like personal skill kind of thing. It's like a soft skill where you're like, up front you have to be very clear. And, for one, I wouldn't typically put Spanish if it wasn't supposed to be Spanish or Greek or whatever it is, because little things like that can derail the whole meeting, and no one likes to go long in meetings. So if you do set expectations and if you're the one presenting it, and if you designed it, I feel like you need to be the one presenting it. You're like, okay, this is this type of wireframe. We're not talking about colors. We're not talking about font sizes. We're not talking about pictures. Not that we can't, hear suggestions about that, but primarily I just want feedback on functionality. Make sure this is doing the job that it needs to do. And so if you can just set very clear expectations and even make a joke about, we don't want the meeting to run long because we just want to get the functionality nailed down. And then later we can all talk about fonts. And so when that happens, and it always happens, sometimes you just have to be rude and say, all right, I think we need to move on to really nailing down the functionality. And a lot of times it's just natural for people to go off on a tangent, and if you've already kind of established yourself as the person leading the meeting, then you can just be like, all right, I think we need to bring it back in here. Sorry, I don't want to be rude, but we need to nail this out before we can move on. And so you just kind of have to practice reining it in. Somebody else right there?
About your background, like you said, you studied graphic design.
Yes. I saved you from the long boring history lesson about my background, but I'll gladly give it now so that you've pried it out of me. Yeah, so I was a graphic design major at the University of Georgia, graduated in 2005, and quickly after that, I was actually doing a lot of illustration, like charcoal drawings and paintings, and I thought I was going to go that route. Got a job at a place doing a lot of websites, and Flash was like really big in 2004 and 2005. It was like pre-iPhone. I don't remember what year the iPhone came out. Maybe 2007-ish. And so I was doing just tons of Flash websites, and that's how I learned all of my horribly awesome animation skills. And just doing tons of animation, tons of web stuff, and all of that was all self-taught. I learned how to program action scripts from reading forums, and I knew that before I even knew how to write HTML, which is way easier. And then slowly started contracting with agencies in Atlanta. Like I did some work with Razorfish and Sapien and Aquarium and Engage, and there's probably some other ones that I'm not remembering. But when I got into that arena of work, I realized like, oh, there's people like really thoughtfully thinking about websites. It's not just like, let me slap this animation on here. It was like, there's a presentation, and here's like very thoughtful wireframes, and all of the IAs at the time, the information architects, were modeling all the data, and I was like, wow, this is like, people are doing this like really professionally. I didn't even know this world existed. I thought everybody was just kind of throwing out websites. FTP upload, all right, the website. Like that was and I was like, wow, this is serious. And so I learned a lot about, during that time, IA became the lesser acronym of, and then the UX acronym emerged. So all the IA designers were now UX designers. And so I just kind of soaked in what everyone was doing around me. Like I was the graphic designer or the visual designer at the time, and I was designing a lot of like stuff on top of wireframes. And then finally I started getting some interest from other clients who saw some more work, and I was like, I could design wireframes. Like I've been doing this for a long time. Just fire up Illustrator. I'll just start designing wireframes in Illustrator. And that's what I did, and I started doing more client work and less contracting work, and then more client work and then less contracting work, and started learning more about code. And so primarily was just, I mean, in terms of UX and UI, it was all self-taught beyond like graphic design school. Yeah. Anybody else? Should I pull up the awkward silence screen again?
All right, well, that's it.
Oh.
Do you ever do like workshops on? That's like one thing I like watching on your YouTube channel is how you use symbols. You're like very efficient in Sketch. I was wondering if you ever do any workshops like that.
I haven't done any workshops, but I would like to start doing some. My studio mates and I just got a really cool new space in Athens. It's like really suited for stuff like that. We got these big tables, and so if anybody's interested in stuff like that, send me an email or something, and it'd be fun to put something together and not have to drive to Atlanta.
What do you want to learn next, or more of, just to expand or get better at?
I kind of want to learn React, but I'm kind of scared of all the packages that I have to like install and stuff. Yeah. I don't know what that is. I kind of want to get into React or React Native, and there was a time when I wanted to learn Objective-C and Swift just to build like native apps. So I feel like I can put together a quick web prototype, but I can't do a mobile, like native mobile app. But like as I get more and more design work and stuff, like I'm always struggling between should I learn that or should I not. So it always changes. I am pretty much a one-man show, except for my wife, who also does all my bookkeeping and stuff, which is a godsend. But apart from me, there's no one else on the team unless they specifically say like, oh, we'd love for you to build this too. And then sometimes I'll do it, and lots of times it's just too much for me to handle that and the development, so I'll subcontract out people to kind of like build a little super team for that project. So yeah, just kind of on a project basis. And a lot of times the clients have developers, willing and able, ready to build something. They just want somebody to bring in a lot more strategy and revitalize their interface and the flows and all that stuff. So I'll do a big pass at everything and work with their team to get it built.
How useful is it for developers to learn about design and like practice design?
I mean, it can't hurt, definitely. Like,
I guess like how often is that put into practice with developers?
it's all like very contextual. It depends on what kind of development you're doing. It's like if you're writing Ruby all day long and you're building back-end data modeling, it's like, just use Bootstrap or something. And somebody else will come and write a better front end. But if you're doing like front end development, I feel like if you're laying out responsive screens and you're writing mobile first, like, and the layout needs to be good, it's hard to do that like as a developer who doesn't know design. Even if you're like following a design exactly and like, okay, I need to make this thing do this. Like, even if I've designed like 3 different breakpoints in static sketch files and I know what needs to happen, I still feel like 10 to 20% of the design happens in tweaking CSS percentages and like, oh, this looks better as 0.875 rem instead of 0.75 rem, and like, let me change it, and I'll tweak for a day or two to get it like looking really tight. And I don't know how I would be able to do that if I didn't have some type of design skill that I could apply to the situation. So if you're doing that type of work, I feel like it's very helpful. And in fact, some of the best front-end developers I know in terms of just layout were once designers, or they started in design and then switched to development. But if you're writing as you get more towards the back end of the app, becomes less of a importance, I think. That's my opinion.
What is your typical day and how do you manage your time
and my 2 youngest kids usually wake up at 6 a.m. and I can hear them through the monitor. Usually overslept my 5 a.m. alarm. Coffee's brewing in the kitchen. I don't know how much detail you want. No, I'm just kidding. No, like I go into work usually after I take my kids to school. Like, I'll either work from home or work from the house, depending on like how quickly I need to get to work. And I keep a pretty regular schedule though. I've got a wife and 4 kids, and I try to be home at 5:30 on the dot if I can, just so my wife doesn't go insane. She stays at home with them, has a much harder job than I do. And I just try to work a regular day, and when I need to, I will bust out work at night. But as much as I can, I try to keep good hours, and I don't do a lot of work at night like I used to. And if I need to cram, I'll usually try to wake up in the morning and do it. So, oh, we're over here. Let's go to this side.
You come into like the beginning of a client, you sit down and you kind of like you're saying, like how do you start a session? Do you kind of go through like blueprint design, or do you kind of just free fall? Like, hey, when you were explaining the lawyer app, is it something that you kind of organized and you kind of did posties and was like, hey, this needs to be organized this way, or do you kind of just, hey, how do we start?
Yeah, so it's definitely different for every project, because I feel like every project is like at a different point. So for the lawyer app, for example, like I had a conversation with their developer partner, and then I had a conversation on the phone with him, and they kind of explained it to me. Then we had a meeting. I drove down to Augusta and met with them, and we probably hung out for 2 or 3 hours. And that's when they were trying to hand me all their sketches and like, yeah, let's do this thing. And they didn't really know what they wanted, but they did know that they wanted to present like a prototype to some potential partners or investors. And so I was like, we just need to tell a compelling story to convince someone like this is what the app could do. And so we did start to get bogged down in like, well, maybe the progress bar could be like this. And well, the Domino's pizza tracker thing does this. And I'm like, guys, come on. We don't need to talk about that right now. Like, let's talk about like what you're going to tell. And so it was kind of like we wasted time for like an hour just talking about all that stuff. And then I was like, I'm going to fire up my Word document, and and it's not a Word document. I don't use Microsoft Word, but I put in just, here's this guy's name. What do you do when they come in? And I just forced them to tell me all the stuff. And I said, all right, now that I have this information, I was like, do you guys agree that it would be good to have screens that tell this story from beginning to end? And they're like, yeah, that'd be great. And so what I did was I just took it back to my office, and I did sketch out like individual screens and took pictures of my horrible, whiteboard drawings, and was like, I'm thinking about putting these screens here, and I sent them, like a Dropbox link to those photos of the whiteboard. I was like, what do you think about these? Like, it's not really pretty. I just want to see what your gut reaction is to these screens in this order. And they're like, yeah, that feels right. I'll know more when I see it. But that was kind of how I started. And then I just spattered out a bunch of 40 different sketch artboards all in a row and built it, and then got feedback from them. They were able to put their comments on each Envision page, and that was pretty helpful. I don't do that a lot, but that was pretty good for that. And that's kind of how that project went.
What's your typical turnaround on a project? How long?
You mean like timing?
Yeah.
Obviously, it depends. I feel like that lawyer app I worked on maybe a week. But mostly, I like to spend at least a month or two on projects, like 4, 8, 12 weeks. I like to think in terms of months. It's easier to sustain yourself if you're billing monthly than hourly or weekly or whatever, which is a whole new topic.
Do you still have time, or do you still practice like the traditional illustration too, or?
I drew Kakashi from Naruto.
Yeah.
I drew that the other day for my son. I've got a picture of it on my phone. I'll show it to you. That's like the only thing I've drawn in years, though. I mean, I try to sit down and draw with my kids and stuff. I would love to I'll do some sketches here and there with the kids, but the priorities that's way down right now. But I would like to. Yes, Ronald Arnholm. He's still there. He's still there. I taught a class at UGA last semester. Yeah, and I saw him and was like, I cannot believe he's still here. Like he was old when I was in school, 12 years ago. But he's still kicking. Great type designer.
All right, I think that's a good spot to end. We're at 8 o'clock. So Matt, thanks for coming out, everybody.
Thank you very much.